Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today we shall be holding the government of Azerbaijan for account for its war crimes against the Armenian people, particularly genocide committed against the ethnic Armenians in Artsakh, also known as Nagorno Karabakh. And in this program, representing the Armenian community, I'm joined by Ara Kirkorian, who is an Armenian missionary. Ara, it's an absolute pleasure to have you back on the Middle East Report. It's about a year ago that you were last on, when you were so kindly informed me and our viewers about the ethnic cleansing that was taking place in Artsakh, also known as Nagorno Karabakh, when the Azeri forces of Azerbaijan invaded your ancient homeland.
Well, thank you, Simon, for inviting me back. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing sort of news hot off the press, as it were.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to that as well. Do you want to remind our viewers, Ari, of your remarkable background? Because sadly, your grandmother survived the horrors of what is known as the Armenian Genocide, the biggest massacre against Armenian Christians and other ethnic Christians by the Ottoman Turks during the First World War in history. She survived it, and you were born in that wonderful place called Jaffa, just below Tel Aviv, during the years of the British Mandate back in '46.
Yes, it's a slightly confusing picture where I'm concerned, but for most Armenians in diaspora, it is a confusing picture. So on my mother's side, maternal side, my grandmother survived the first genocide, the Hamidian massacres, which people don't really talk about in the late 1890s. She was an orphan, and then she grew up in a convent that looked after her. She then married a young shepherd, and they had two children, two daughters. And when the big genocide started, 15 to 18, she was marched into the desert along with many others, and both daughters perished. So she had to leave them in a cave. And the stories she recounted were horrendous, but she ended up being saved somewhere along the line. She got out along with others. On my father's side, there were pilgrims to the Holy Land 600 to 800 years ago, so they'd had a presence in the old city of Jerusalem to start with, in the Armenian quarter. And then my grandfather, who was a cobbler, but obviously, doing quite well with, must have been luxury shoes or whatever, he and his sister managed to raise funds and build outside the walls on the old Bethlehem Road. So he and his brother built two houses side by side, and there were just fields then. German colony was nearby, and it was nicknamed the Kirkorian Corner because they were the first houses we built. But sadly, in 1948, when the end of the British Mandate, the lines were drawn in Jerusalem, and our property fell on the wrong side. So we were declared enemies of the state, and that was the end of our home. So we then moved to Cyprus, and I was only a baby then. I was born in Jaffa, as you say, but that was my mother's home. The joke in the family is that it wasn't a donkey that took my mother to Jaffa to give birth to me. It must have been a bus, I think. But refugees in Cyprus, I grew up with other Armenian refugees from Jerusalem. And then when it came to schooling age, senior schooling age, they were 11, moved to the UK. I was a boarder then until my parents came over to the UK and settled in the UK.
Amazing. And also, do you want to share your own personal faith, how you came to faith in Jesus Christ as well? Because I think this is a very important component of your amazing story, but also the story of the Armenian people.
Yes, well, as a child, I was forced with my brother to go to church every Sunday. And the Armenian Orthodox Church is slightly heavy, as opposed to the churches I go to now, where we raise our arms and sing and worship songs. And as soon as I got to university at the age of 18 and freedom, I stopped going. And slowly but surely, Beatle era and all that in Liverpool, I turned away from church. I couldn't see any, because I learnt nothing as a child, and there was no junior sort of church or whatever. You just stood amongst all the elders, so I learnt nothing. It was only after I got married and had 2 little children that we had a visit from a very nasty person came to stay with us. And I can honestly say that I was staring not the devil himself in the eyes, but one of the devil's workers or fallen angels, or whatever you want to call this person who came to stay. He tried to wreck our marriage. We called the police and threw him out. And then, you know, God opened my heart, and my wife gave me a Bible. She hadn't stopped believing. And I couldn't put the New Testament down. I just kept reading it again and again, and I was, you know, on the shores of the Lake of Galilee with Jesus and the disciples. It was absolutely wonderful. And I'm not unique. You hear lots of stories like that.
Amazing, amazing. So if we take ourselves back a year, just over a year since the Azerbaijani forces invaded Nagorno-Karabakh, and of course the Armenians affectionately call that area, Artsakh, was invaded by Azerbaijan, in which over 100,000 ethnic Armenians were forced to flee their ancient homeland, literally in the space of a couple of days. To show where we are 1 year on from that invasion by Azerbaijan of Armenia.
Well, as far as our family is concerned, we had very close ties with Artsakh. Our youngest daughter spent a year doing voluntary work in Artsakh, living in Shushi, which they're now calling Shusha. And so we visited it on more than one occasion, met the people, and the family where she stayed for a year became personal friends. And so when we heard about the ghastly things last year, the blockade and then the exodus, the forced exodus, of course we were praying like mad, not just for them, but for all the Artsakh Armenians. And it took them three days to get to Yerevan. The pictures have been shown many times of the queues of the cars, winding their way, inching their way all the way through the Lachin corridor into Armenia, and then the journey to Yerevan isn't exactly around the corner either. And now we're supporting them, but this is just one family of three children, but they're grown-ups now. And there are many other families that are in dire straits. Some have left the country, migrated either to Russia, where a lot of Armenians live, or Canada or the US. So up to between 10 and 20,000 have already left as refugees to these other countries. But the others are below the poverty line. Lots of people try raising money for them. And housing is so difficult in Yerevan, because everyone wants to be in Yerevan, being the capital. That's where the work is. It won't be the villages. So, you know, there are many organisations. The one that my brother and I support right from the beginning is a children's organisation, Street Children. And so we've been giving funds to the children of these refugees as well. So a lot of help, but a lot of angst, and anxiety and distress.
I can imagine. So let's have a look and take ourselves back a year to when the Azerbaijani forces invaded Artsakh, which shocked the Iranian people. But thanks to CBN, they covered this in great detail, unlike a lot of other mainstream news channels.
Following a rapid September offensive, Azerbaijan recaptured Nagorno-Karabakh, displacing most of its 120,000 ethnic Armenian residents. Recently, the World Court mandated Azerbaijan to allow these refugees to return. But for those forced to flee, the prospect of living under Azeri rule is terrifying.
I was in my father's village when the attack took place. The first explosions were in the village. All of us were shocked. We did not know what to do. The kids were at school, my brother's kids. We were trying to figure out how to bring the kids back because we had to take them somewhere safe.
Unfortunately, the news cycle has ignored most of what's happened of this ethnic cleansing that started on September 19th.
We saw destroyed cars near us, shrapnel everywhere, in front of my feet. I was struck in the hand. It was so stressful. I didn't know whether to run or to help. I didn't know what to do. There were wounded people approaching the car asking for help. They were falling, passing out because they had lost so much blood.
This created a massive humanitarian crisis and generated allegations of Azeri war crimes. With the world now distracted by Israel's war with Hamas, Azerbaijan sees an opportunity to push even further. This Armenian monastery behind me is called Tatev, and it's over 1,100 years old. It's also one of the most popular tourist spots in the entire country of Armenia. And this is the area that is under threat from Azerbaijan, who now says that this is what they call Western Azerbaijan, and they're claiming that this land belongs to them. But if you look at the dozens and dozens of churches like this that are all over 1,000 years old that dot this region, it's pretty easy to see that this has been Armenian territory for a long, long time.
We hear they have a mind to capture our province. That's the Turks' idea. Erdogan has said so many times. Now the Russians and Azerbaijanis have joined the Turks. They want to eliminate the Armenian nation.
As Hamas is to Israel, Azerbaijan and Turkey are to Armenia and the Armenian Christians.
In 1915, after the genocide, we lost much of our land to the Turks. I'd like to see that land returned to us someday. I just want Armenia to flourish.
Armenians, though, feel ignored by the world.
Please do not forget your true Christian brothers and sisters in Armenia that are being attacked and forcibly removed from their homelands right now.
Maybe all Christian countries will come to our defense so we don't disappear from the map.
Without Russian protection, Azerbaijan's forces are poised to continue seizing territory, and people here worry about a repeat of the Armenian genocide of 1915. From Armenia, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Great report there by CBN, and that's a clear reminder of the horrific events that occurred just over a year ago when the Armenian people were forced to flee their ancient homeland known as Artsakh. Ari, can you just share with us the atrocities and the war crimes that were actually committed by the Azeri forces? Because CBN have covered this, we've covered this on, I've covered this on the Middle East Report. But apart from that, there's been very little international news coverage, considering that a whole nation was invaded and over 100,000 people forced to flee their homes within the space of a few days, which in itself is a war crime. But share with us the crimes committed by the Azeri forces when they invaded Artsakh or Nagorno Karabakh.
I can share in much greater detail than shown elsewhere on media, but I'd like to just correct that figure because we quote 100,000, 110, but we have to recall that the war was 2020 as well as building up 22. There were people being killed, soldiers being killed, and of course 2023. So the figure is more like 140 to 160,000. So much higher if you take the span of the 4 years, 2020 to 24. I was very lucky to be able to attend on Sunday and also on Tuesday, yesterday, 2 meetings where a panel of experts from Armenian panel experts were invited to present the latest and to update Armenians and others who attended to actually, bring them to speed with evidence on the ground. And these 4 speakers, there was a lady called Siranush Sahakyan, a lawyer and director of international and comparative law. You can see that up on the screen. And the former human rights defender of the Republic of Armenia, and from Artsakh himself, Artsakh Baglarian, former state ministry and human rights defender, the Republic of Artsakh, and finally from the US, an Armenian from the US, a lawyer, specialist of international law and accountability. And these four is spelt out clearly on Sunday. Two of them unfortunately couldn't come, they couldn't get a visa in time, and they are actually doing a tour of Paris, Brussels, London and Berlin. And the main notes from Siranush Sahakian, the human rights lawyer, is that there are still 23 prisoners being held in Azeri prisoners. 5 are civilians, it could be 6 are civilians, it might be farmers or just shopkeepers. 6 high-profile figures, meaning from the parliament of Artsakh. They were not allowed to leave in that exodus. They were stopped and taken straight to Baku prison. And 9 soldiers, so that makes that total of 23. And of course there is still lots of talk about trying to get them back, but Azerbaijan doesn't allow any legal representation outside Azerbaijan, and of course the lawyers will be very biased. There are false accusations made against them, and no outside body, international body, has been allowed in, not the Red Cross, and no one from the UN, so they're isolated there. And one of them went on hunger strike and nearly died, but he's now back on eating, as far as we know. So she explained all that, and she explained that the prisoners, the high-profile prisoners who were in the Artsakh parliament, they are labelled as terrorists.
And this also includes, doesn't it, the former president of Artsakh, and we're all talking about the top echelons of the government in Artsakh are being detained in Baku, and of course, as you were saying, being denied access by the International Red Cross, which is a war crime. So share with us how their treatment is essentially a war crime, and does anyone know how they're faring under being held prisoner by the Azerbaijani government?
Very little information is available. They're not allowed to speak to them. They might get sort of a little bit of, I don't know, a few seconds phone call time, but then they're being observed maybe and they can't say what they want to say. So very little information is filtering out. The only thing that the Armenian government knows is the number of prisoners and who they are, effectively, the names. But they're also trying to, of course, to get the bodies back. There are lots of bodies of fallen soldiers and other citizens of Artsakh that are lying there, or who knows where they are. So it's a real melee of horror. So the second person who spoke, the former human rights defender of Armenia, he showed some absolutely horrendous videos. He didn't really hide much. He explained it, and you could see it if you wanted to actually look at them, of how soldiers were treated, and how they're a bit like ISIS at the beach in Libya, when the Egyptian prisoners wouldn't denounce Christianity, and they sawed their heads off and loaded it up on social media. And they did the same, and they took great delight in videoing the atrocities and then uploading it and sharing it in Azeri media. But we all know that once you upload something, it's worldwide, everyone can access it. So Armenia does have these videos which they are going to use, or using, with the law courts and whatever that's available for them to present the horrors, the claims. But the other thing that he pointed out, which perhaps I'm jumping ahead a bit, was that the threat of the Azeris moving into the Armenian territories, the sovereign territories, especially on the border with Iran, where they're trying to create this corridor to link Azerbaijan with Nakhichevan and Turkey, that they've actually set up military bases within the sovereign territory of Armenia. And from there, they're threatening the villages that are close by. They're placing mines around them so they can't farm anymore. And the roads they built for the military access to these bases are ruining the forests. You know, the environment's being damaged, the beautiful mountainous ecosystem. And the water, of course, coming to their taps now is polluted. You know, it showed pictures of that. So when he presented all of that, you could see that not only were the atrocities carried out in Artsakh during that horrible time, but also now the threatening behavior and the potential of them moving in and physically, by force, creating this corridor, the Zangezur corridor.
Also, it's important to note, isn't it, Ari, that what the Azerbaijani forces did was very similar to that of Hamas on October the 7th. So actually recording their crimes on body cams and then glorifying in it and then uploading them to the social media sites, or even worse, showing the relatives or the victims the horrors that they've committed themselves.
Yes, it defies, you know, human behavior, and I put it down to pure evil and satanic work. And one of the mothers of a soldier that had his head cut off, because they had his mobile, they uploaded and winged it across to the mother, who opened it and saw live, not live, but recording of her son. I mean, can you imagine what that does to a mother, or anyone, but to a mother specifically? It's horrendous. And all these crimes are actually being presented by the panel of these 4 experts at the various courts. And I'll come to the courts in a minute and what the courts are saying.
Ari, do you want to unpack for us the level of hatred that has been directed against the Armenian people by Azerbaijan, and we know that they're also backed up by the Turks as well. Just explain to us where this hatred comes from, particularly from our viewers who are not really familiar with the Caucasus. They're not very familiar with the Armenian story, but essentially we're seeing that the Azeri government of Azerbaijan is essentially an Islamist government that delights in causing terror and affliction, just like we see in other nations across the Middle East, including Iran and these terror groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and ISIS and others.
Well, I think it starts from the top, and I didn't want to mention the president's name, but I think everyone knows it's Aliyev. And his dynasty, inherited from his father, a dynasty has always been a dictatorship, as in many other countries, we know. And the only way he can survive that dictatorship is, one, to imprison all dissidents, and there are many, over 100 plus political dissidents known, Azeri, in prison. There are lots in hiding in France, for example, and one was murdered recently because, just like Putin sent Russians to kill with the Novichok, they have the same sort of hit squad for the Azeri police to kill Azeri dissidents in France, for example. So you have this hatred starting from the very top. And one of the lawyers was presenting the case as to why there is Armenophobia, is because it's the only way that Aliyev and his government henchmen can stay in power, because if they can build up this hatred and they can build up the narrative that, you know, we're going to take over Armenia because it's our land, you know, we're going to repossess what is Western Azerbaijan, and all this is for them to stay in power, because it detracts from the problems at home. It detracts, you know, any argument the opposition have, because the people are saying, wow, this leader is great, you know, he's going to gain more territory, more wealth, and so on. And of course, we're not even touching on the eco side of the gold and copper mines now being established in Nagorno Karabakh. I mean, that's one of the main reasons.
And Ara, explain the plight. Is it about 20,000 ethnic Armenians are still in Artsakh or Nagorno Karabakh under occupation by the Azeri forces? Is there any news coming out about their plight and how they're being treated by Azerbaijan?
Very little. Very little is known, so very little is said on the Armenian side, because they don't want to fake news, they don't want to inflate the figures, but they don't want to obviously minimize it or rule it out of court. And there will be some, yes, who refuse to move. There'll be some, we know, who are elderly and just too ill to move. But how many there are and which villages, we don't know. And my wife and I were lucky on one occasion to go right into the heart of Artsakh, right, high plateau where there's another Stonehenge, Karahunj as we call it, and the village called New Stonehenge. We met a wonderful farmer, shepherd, and he looked like a Scottish farmer until he spoke Armenian. And of course, villages like that were cut off from the capital, Stepanakert or Shushi, very little information is coming out. We do know that some of the villages did suffer atrocities, and they have been recorded and will be presented to European law courts and so on. But the 20,000 figure is hard to to verify.
Okay, so let's have a look at this video now. This is entitled "The Fate of the Armenian Detainees," and this is covered by Christian Solidarity International at the UN in Geneva, which is the home of the Human Rights Council, to bring awareness to the international community regarding war crimes committed by Azeri forces when they invaded Azerbaijan over a year ago.
After the 44-day Azerbaijani aggression against Artsakh in 2020, a trilateral agreement was signed on November 9 between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia. This agreement explicitly called for the exchange of prisoners of war, hostages, and other detained individuals, as well as the repatriation of the remains of those who perished. Despite this agreement, Azerbaijan continues to defy its obligations. Illegal blockade resulted in a new aggression in 2023 and forced deportation. Existential threats still persist against Armenians. Even more troubling is that Azerbaijan continues to unlawfully detain 23 individuals, and this includes 6 civilians, 9 prisoners of war, and 8 high-profile figures of Artsakh, including presidents, former state minister, philanthropist Ruben Vartanyan. Juan Mendes, the first UN Special Advisor on Genocide Prevention, has made it clear that targeting the leadership of a vulnerable community is indicative of a genocide. It signals an intent to destroy a community, particularly when paired with the mass deportation of its members. Beyond these 23 detainees, there are over 80 documented cases of captivity which remain unacknowledged as of this day by Azerbaijani government. So these people were subjected to forced enforced disappearances, which amounts to war crime.
And that was courtesy of Christian Solidarity International, and that was the inquest being taken place in Geneva at the UN Council for Human Rights, really detailing evidence of Azerbaijan's war crimes committed against the Armenian people, particularly their soldiers, during that conflict a year ago. Ara, I just want to put the focus and the attention now really on Azerbaijan, because over the last decade or so, Azerbaijan has been what is known as whitewashing. So using sports and big kind of political events in order to kind of like cover up their sins of genocide and human rights abuses. So in 2021, they hosted a few of the games for Euro 2020. We also see that Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, recently, only last month, back in September, hosted the Formula One Grand Prix. And coming up in a couple of weeks, they're also hosting the big UN conference on climate change, known as COP29. But share with us how they are using their oil and gas money that they are actually receiving in order to whitewash their crimes of genocide against the Armenian people, to raise their stock internationally, so the international community is not doing what it should, and that's condemning the regime of Azerbaijan?
Well, Azerbaijan has got the upper hand, and it knows it. The upper hand being that when Putin invaded Ukraine, there were problems with the gas and oil supplies, and Azerbaijan has that in abundance, and therefore the EU has to tread carefully. Ursula von der Leyen went to Azerbaijan knowing full well, you know, the human rights record of Azerbaijan, knowing full well many other issues, especially Nagorno Karabakh and so on, and was seen smiling, shaking hands as though nothing existed other than a bright, friendly Azerbaijan, you know, populace and government. And so with the sort of the risk of supplies being, if they were to sanction Azerbaijan, you know, cutting off oil and gas for Azerbaijan could be disastrous for the EU. And in the UK, of course, BP, we know BP brings in lots of revenue into the UK government, and there's absolutely no way BP is going to be sanctioned. Or be asked to minimize or whatever. And on the subject of COP29, it's ironic that it's been recorded by NGOs that, environmental NGOs, that they propose to increase gas and oil production in Baku by 30% in the next 10 years. So the irony of COP29 being held there you know, is just evident.
And there's also very disturbing evidence as well come to light that has been reported. I did a program on it last month on a program I do called Behind the Headlines, where effectively they were accusing the government of Azerbaijan of cozying up to the Russians, of actually selling on the black market Russian gas that was then being exported to Azerbaijan, and then it was being exported into Europe. So effectively, this is a way that Azerbaijan could overcome the sanctions that are placed on Russia for its invasion of the Ukraine. And this is a way of supplying Europe with Russian gas, but through an intermediary which is Azerbaijan. And so the sheer hypocrisy of the EU is shocking, the silence as well when it comes to the plight of the Armenians, but also the farce, for example, that Azerbaijan has got rich through these with these fossil fuels such as oil and gas, and they have no intention whatsoever of reducing them anyway. So the big question is, why has the international community not looked at the crimes of genocide committed by this regime, and why are they rewarding them with prestigious political conferences like COP29? Why is the F1 Grand Prix able to actually have one of their, be able to host it in Baku? And then of course it's the major tournament for football tournaments and also athletics as well.
Yes, I get it. You've summed it up very well, Simon. On the subject of football, of course, Arsenal were playing in Baku a couple of years ago, I think, or maybe 3 years ago. And there was a very good Armenian football player called Mkhrdyan who played for Manchester United, then moved to Arsenal. Arsenal were then playing, I think
it was Chelsea, it was in the final of the UEFA League Cup.
But the thing was that because he was Armenian, Mkhrdyan could not take part. And instead of Arsenal saying, right, that's it, we'll pull out, there's no way we're going to play, they played, but the players were annoyed enough, upset enough, to actually demonstrate on the pitch with his name to show that, they played, but they weren't exactly happy about it. So it's all money, it's all, corruption in my book, and I've worked all around the world, including the UK, and I haven't come across a single government that has not been corrupt, one form or another, some more than others.
But why do you think, for example, we know that next month the international spotlight will be on Baku, it will be on Azerbaijan, and yet their own human rights treatment of their own dissidents is absolutely shocking. But why is there silence on behalf of the international community and pretty much our mainstream media to Azerbaijan's invasion of Artsakh last year, and how what the Azeri forces did was to commit war crimes, and essentially what we saw then was ethnic cleansing on a huge scale.
That is a how many $1 million question, which doesn't really have a reply that would fit everyone's opinion. Unfortunately, I can't answer that other than to repeat that, you know, corruption speaks, money speaks, like BP. Formula One, a lot of Armenians wrote to the top of Formula One to say, do you realize that whilst Formula One's taking place in Baku, within reach sound of the prisoners, the Armenian prisoners in the jail who've been tortured and kept there against international law, you are hosting an event that's bragging the wonders of Azerbaijan. We've got no one received a reply to my knowledge. So again, it's hypocrisy. The actual drivers in F1, whatever they call themselves, they don't have a conscience either. Otherwise, they would just not drive. They boycott it. So it defies, for me, it defies all logic and understanding. But because I presented earlier the 4 Armenian experts on the panel, the legal experts and so on, it's not just Armenians who are fighting their corner, but what's happened in Artsakh and in Armenia, the threat to Armenia. There are 2 NGOs that I did some research. One is Global Witness Report. They were established only a few years ago, but they look into all the countries where there is conflict and where there is harm to the environment and to populace. And the other one was the Centre for Law and Justice. And both of them listed in their reports of the atrocities that were taking place, and also not just the atrocities, but the actual threat of Armenia eventually being wiped out by Azerbaijan making these unbelievable claims that Armenia has always been Western Azerbaijan and that they have the right to return to Azerbaijan. To me, that I don't understand that, because there are cartographers that have got maps, not Armenian cartographers, Italian and so on, and Flemish, who've detailed maps of the world showing Armenia going back hundreds of years. And in the British Museum, there's a clay tablet from Babylon that actually depicts Armenia in the center of the world, right? I'm not bragging here, but it's actually in the British Museum. So the evidence is there, so I cannot understand how Aliyev and his henchmen feel that they can get past historians and lawmakers they're doing all this to back up their final move to push into Armenia and claim. And there's a point here which is very interesting, Simon. We took notes when we went to the meeting, my wife and I, and there are actually now there's an organization set up in Baku for the return of refugees to their lost land, Western Azerbaijan, the Caucasian Albanians. And there are people have signed up, to 300,000 Azeris have signed up to go back to their lost homeland. So with all this taking place, you know, these 2 NGOs have highlighted not only the fact that the cultural heritage, all the wonderful churches, everything have been totally destroyed or partly destroyed, but that you know, that there will one day be a time when Armenia will no longer exist. But
isn't that the danger that what we've seen, sadly, on behalf of the Armenian government, was not to put up a strong enough fight to defend Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh, and then since then we've seen as well, to appease this radical extremist regime, that Armenia has given more territory away and hope that will appease the president of Azerbaijan. And yet, the more territory that you give these dictators, the more they want, and the more that they then feel that they can push in. So isn't there a great danger now that the entire nation of Azerbaijan is under threat, as you just mentioned, because the international community needs to stand up to Azerbaijan. But share with us how, for example, the geostrategic impact of Russia's war with Ukraine is having on Armenia, because prior to this, it was the Russians that were the main protector of the Armenian people, and since they are now needing the support of the Iranians, they're now needing the support of the Turks against Ukraine and the West. Therefore, they're making new alliances in the Caucasus and the Middle East, which doesn't bode well for Armenia or the Armenian people.
You have summed it up well. The shift in the Russian support for Armenia, and if you like, the closeness Armenia has had with Russia, especially during Soviet times, although that was obviously forced, has completely changed. And Armenia is divided. A small portion still long for the Soviet days, but a majority don't want that. Majority want alignment with the EU, the West, and so on. And of course, this has opened up the door for Putin to say, you rebels, we're no longer going to support you. We've done everything for you over the decades or centuries, and now this is how you're behaving towards us. So when it came to this Lachin corridor saga last year, they did absolutely nothing. Very little. I dare say one or two soldiers had a heart for what they saw, the suffering, and might have done.
And to explain to our viewers, this was was it a 10-month siege of Artsakh by Azerbaijani forces, actually closing the main corridor from Artsakh Karabakh into the mainland in Armenia, which meant that supplies of food, energy, and vital humanitarian aid couldn't get through.
That's right. It was a siege, effectively, and everyone knows in history how sieges worked or didn't work, but usually they did, and whoever was being sieged gave in and said, okay, we'll let you in, and then they were either massacred totally or whatever. In the case of Artsakh, I think that because there was so much international attention, they couldn't actually massacre. They obviously killed a few on the sidelines, as mentioned earlier, the horrible videos. But so the 120,000 that fled had no options. And for Aliyev to say, no, you can have, citizenship, Azeri citizenship, you'll have freedom and so on, and how anyone could actually believe in that. No Armenian would believe that ever. And in fact, this is backed up by something that I saw, a slide that was presented by these experts, showed a first day cover of the footprint of Nagorno Karabakh with someone dressed up as though he was disinfecting the entire land with a space outfit, spraying to eliminate any trace of Armenian heritage. And we know that that's backed up with what's happening in these NGO reports, the cultural genocide that's taking place, churches being demolished and graveyards completely, demolished as well, destroyed, is part of their systematic attempts to show, history-wise, in years to come, that there were never any Armenians in Artsakh. The same in Nakhichevan, this enclave that is Azerbaijan and Armenia is between the mainland Azerbaijan and the enclave, which is connected to Turkey. Nakhichevan in 2019, there's lots of video evidence, I saw it live as it was happening. They bulldozed 6,000 more beautiful stone crosses, the khachkars, into the river, Arat, and they destroyed about 89 medieval churches. And now, officially, as far as Azerbaijan is concerned, Nakhichevan never had any Armenians on its land. So they want the same thing for Artsakh, and then ultimately Armenia. They'll relabel everything Caucasian.
And that's genocide. That is essentially committing genocide to wipe out an ethnic minority's history. Counts as genocide. And I suppose one thing, Ara, that concerns me most is the kind of silence of the international community regarding this. You don't see any kind of news reports on what's happening in Artsakh. or the intentions of Azerbaijan. Everything's completely whitewashed. And it's almost as if like the Azeri government has influence over our Western media because no one's reporting this, or we either think that this is in the Caucasus, this is too far away, so therefore this is not in our geostrategic interest, which it is because there's only two Christian nations effectively, isn't there, in the Caucasus. One is Armenia and the other is Georgia. The rest are Islamist states. But share with us as well the partnership between Azerbaijan and Turkey that still over 100 years on still refuses to recognize its role in the biggest massacre against the Armenian people in history, where over 1.5 million Armenians, including your family, and other ethnic Christians were murdered at the hands of the Ottoman Turks during the First World War.
I think there's so much hypocrisy abounding by Azerbaijan in this regard. But yes, what you said is correct. There is this so-called Turkic unity and Turkic desire to make the entire region, with Armenia standing in the way, Turkic. And so that is a strong bond between Erdogan and Aliyev. They want to see that, and they'll do anything to succeed, particularly Aliyev. But Aliyev is playing a very shrewd, he's fluent in English as well, so he puts across, he in the EU, speaking to the EU, who give one story, and then on his blogs, he gives another story. He knows that, for example, in Iran, what they call Western Azerbaijan, within Iran, there are 6 million plus Azeris, and Iran knows that there is a possible risk they'll want autonomy or want to join Azerbaijan as one main homeland for the Azeris. So Iran has to be very careful with what it says it does. And then Iran, of course, is the enemy of Israel. And so you've got this inter-regional warring that's going on politically and where the armies are concerned. So it's very difficult to unravel it all. And of course, Russia is in there as well. Russia's in with Iran. Iran's feeding Russia with drones and what have you to attack Ukraine. So the whole region is an absolute mess. And Armenia is too small, too insignificant. But the point I'm trying to make is compare it to Kosovo. And the international law at the meetings I went to said the difference between Kosovo and Armenia is that Kosovo was surrounded by the West, effectively Europe, and there was a threat from within and a threat from without. And so Kosovo was given preferential treatment and declared an independent country. Armenia is too insignificant, and who's worried about what's going to happen in Nagorno Karabakh, for example?
Yeah, because the geostrategic alignments in the Middle East and the Caucasus are absolutely crazy. Because, for example, the Iranians are aligning themselves, as you mentioned, very closely with the Russians. They are effectively against Israel. Israel is supporting, for reasons other than oil, the forces of Azerbaijan that are using Israeli drones and technology against the Armenian people. And the Armenians themselves are looking to Iran as an ally. And then we have, for example, the Israelis are close to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is incredibly close to Turkey, particularly the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, who's called for the annihilation of the state of Israel and for Muslim nations to unite against Israel to destroy Israel. So the big question is the kind of natural alliances between the Middle East and the Caucasus is for an Israeli Armenian alliance based on shared values, on our Judeo-Christian heritage, knowing what it's like to be surrounded by hostile enemies that want your destruction. And that's exactly the same case. But because of regional alliances and bigger threats, it seems like an absolute bizarre alliances that we see in the Caucasus and also in the Middle East right now.
You summed it up very well. It is bizarre. I think as Christians we would say there's the enemies, playing, juggling the balls and making sure that no one's happy, that no one creates an alliance for peace. Simon, I have to say it, they all need Jesus in my book. If they all had Jesus, we'd have none of this trouble. But yes, it is bizarre and it is horrible.
And also share with us the importance as well for our Christians watching this program that the history of Armenia, it was the first Christian nation to receive the gospel, and that has been a central part of the identity of Armenia and the Armenian people for thousands of years. And yet you have, your nation represents Christianity in a very dark and dangerous region, which is the Caucasus, and also then Middle Eastern states are linked to that it's vital that Christians pray and stand with the Armenian people, particularly as the international community is silent, and also our world's media is silent on the genocide being committed by Azerbaijani forces and by its regime itself.
Yes, I think prayers are very much welcomed by Armenia and Armenians in the diaspora as well. I'm not saying that all Armenians have faith, strong faith, but an Armenian will always say first and foremost they're Christian because they're not going to tick any other box. And yes, prayers for anyone watching, for Armenia, support, and quiet demonstrations or letters sent to the relevant bodies and governments. You know, in Britain, for example, you know, Armenians write to MPs. I know our MP personally, so I've written to him, and others should do the same and draw attention to what's going on, and to just do away with this unbelievable hypocrisy. It's unbelievable.
And also our new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, also needs a history and a political lesson on Armenia, as he really did get his facts wrong recently. He was obviously briefed by someone who's very pro Azerbaijan, which did cause a diplomatic incident between Armenia and this country.
Yes, I wonder who that might have been, because we know that, you know, the cross-party parliamentary groups for every country, and we know the representatives for Armenia, obviously, and we also know representatives for Azerbaijan. And the chairman for Azerbaijan party group, I won't mention his name, he went across to Azerbaijan several times. He so-called monitored the free and fair elections and declared them free and fair. But, you know, I think quietly he might have, you know, benefited one way or the other, even if it was just a free trip. And in London, the Azeris wined and dined a lot of MPs, and one of the MPs was a Christian who reported back. It's available online, you can view it. So it's when you've got money, you can, you know, grease the palm of anyone, in my book, my experience. And unfortunately, people are happy to accept, you know, and not worry about human rights or any other consequences.
Which is tragic, but we do need to hold not only our Foreign Office and our new Labour government to account on the way that they deal with Armenia, particularly the way that they deal with Azerbaijan, because if they claim to be interested in human rights, then you have to take this up as a cause. But it's also the United States, as well as the world's remaining superpower, also needs to speak up on behalf of the Armenian people. And thankfully, there are some brave and courageous senators in the US Senate who are actually condemning Azerbaijan for actually hosting COP29 and demanding the release of the Armenian prisoners that were held in Baku, but also the other dissidents within Azerbaijan who are fighting for their own freedom against this horrific regime. So share with us how important it is to be aware and informed of what's happening regarding Azerbaijan and its crimes of genocide and its ethnic cleansing against the Armenian people.
I think it's very important, not just for Christians, Christians who obviously have a heart to not only pray for the marginalized, pray for victims, but also for the enemies, you know, to pray for the enemies of the countries that are being attacked or whatever, tried to be erased from history, as the case of Armenians. But I think that the important thing to remember is that although you might have some senators that support in the US, you might have some MPs like and House of Lords like wonderful Baroness Cox and so on, they are lone voices, and lone voices can't come together and unite and create a loud voice. And so the lone voices are only ones in my book with a conscience and can't stand what's going on. But it's very sad, like you mentioned David Lammy, I mean, not to do his homework and to say that it was a land that was reconquered and taken, and not knowing about Armenians having been in Artsakh for thousands of years, not just 100, thousands of years, you know. And for architects to be from London, British architects appointed for Shushi to redesign the whole city. One of the Armenian human rights lawyers, they're taking him to court, their company to court, and I think they might pull out of the planning, the planning for reconstruction of Shushi. So things are happening a bit, but it's small because Armenia is so insignificant, has no oil. If Armenia disappears, it'll have no economic impact on the world at all. Then Christians will
have a huge spiritual impact upon the world, and also a huge historical impact with if the Armenian nation is no longer here. But we know that God is protecting your nation. We'll continue to pray for Armenia. We'll continue to pray for you and your people. But also, as in this program, of actually telling your narrative and actually speaking up against the war crimes and crimes of genocide and crimes of ethnic cleansing committed by the regime of Azerbaijan.
Well, thank you for presenting it and giving me the opportunity to. You know, I might be a lone voice, but thank you for...
You're a great voice. So, Ari, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on the Middle East Report this week. Thank you so much for unpacking us and giving us an update 1 year on from the ethnic cleansing and the invasion of Azerbaijani forces against Artsakh, also known as Nagorno Karabakh. So, big thank you. And I want to thank you for watching this program at home. As Christians, we cannot be afford to be silenced when we see the rise of evil. And what we've seen with the Azerbaijan government is nothing less than evil. Ethnic cleansing of an entire indigenous people known as the Armenian people from the ancient homeland known as Artsakh, and no international condemnation, no UN security resolutions against Azerbaijan, instead rewarding Azerbaijan with F1 contracts and also COP29. Enough is enough. So thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.